So hello my dear viewers, as you might have rightly guessed from the topic of this video, we will today talk about everybody's favorite topic nowadays, that is Russian-Ukraine conflict, or rather as many of you prefer to call it, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But in this video, we will neither discuss what some of you might be expecting, that I might give the whole timeline of all the events, what happened till now since the Russian military had crossed the Ukrainian border in the late February of this year, nor we will discuss about the possibility of whether the World War III would start or not, as many YouTubers lately who suddenly become experts in the international politics try to entertain such questions. If you are expecting any of these things, then this video might not be very helpful to you. But wait, what we really gonna talk about is even more important than those things, and that is not getting as much attention as it truly deserves. Basically, I will talk about some history regarding this whole issue, which will give you some idea that how the West, especially the USA, can be held responsible, mostly for the whole Ukrainian crisis that we are facing right now as we speak, and also how this whole crisis could have been prevented in the first place since the very beginning of 2014. And I will also give you some historical facts which will expose the West and make it look like a hypocrite. And not just that, I will also talk about how even if both the parties, the Russia and Ukraine involved in the conflict, come to a peaceful resolution, the problem of separatism in Ukraine would not be resolved until the Ukrainian establishment address some key issues and make some reforms in order to bridge the gap between the people of Eastern and Western Ukraine. And I will also talk about how Ukraine really have to denazify itself, because remember, when Vladimir Putin says that one of the main reasons behind his military invasion of Ukraine is to denazify the country, just do not dismiss it as a propaganda, because there is a certain truth in that. I will break this discussion into two videos. In first one, which is this one, we will look at the causes or forces external to Ukraine which might be responsible for the current Ukrainian conflict. And in the second video, I will discuss the causes or factors internal to Ukraine which directly or indirectly adding fuel to the whole fire. So now let's begin. But see, before jumping into the main thing, I want to make something very clear here. First, I, as any other reasonable person, totally oppose the military invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and the only real victim in this whole conflict is the innocent common people of Ukraine. Only a psychopath can justify such destruction and killings, and everybody else wants nothing short of total peace and normalcy to return to the people of Ukraine. But in all of that, we often overlook some crucial aspects and we buy any propaganda or narrative that is thrown to us. Just like we often believe in the utterly bizarre narrative that Putin is nothing but an imperialist and paranoid dictator who wants to establish the great Russian Empire by conquering all the former Soviet republics. And just like Adolf Hitler, he won't stop at Ukraine but eventually consume all of the Europe and Central Asia. We believe in such kind of narratives because we don't know the facts which will show how the West can be held responsible for the whole Russian-Ukrainian problem. And most importantly, given how some critics in India criticize the neutral stance of Indian government on the current Ukrainian-Russian conflict, thus it becomes more important for us to throw some light on the whole issue. As we proceed further in this video, and in the next one, it will become more clear to you that why the stand of our union government on the current conflict is as practical and as reasonable as it can possibly be. So without any further delay, let's dive in and unravel the truth. Putin himself has said that he doesn't want to occupy Ukraine, but his goal is to demilitarize and denazify the country. And also many argue that he might as well as overthrow the current pro-West Ukrainian regime, which according to him is unfriendly to Russia. So according to him and some others, these are his top priorities. My point is whether Putin is lying about his real ambitions concerning Ukraine or not is something only time can tell. But if you look at the important events that predate the whole Ukrainian crisis, and I just do not mean the current crisis, but also whatever happened around and after 2014, when the whole problem really began. If you really look at the developments that took place before 2014, then you will get to know that this whole conflict could have been avoided if the West, especially the USA, had taken care of Russia's legitimate security concerns. But what West exactly did, if you ask? First, for that, you have to understand NATO, which is North Atlantic Treaty Organization, as most of you know. This is a sort of military alliance formed by some Western European countries to protect themselves against any potential invasion of the Soviet Union into the Western Ukraine. And this happened during the Cold War, when each side was trying to counter the influence of another side, and at the same time competing with each other to exert their influence over the neutral nations. But when the USSR ended and disintegrated into various countries in 1991, so common sense would tell us, because the Soviet Union has ended, the organization that was formed only to counter the expansion of the Soviet Union inside the Western Europe would also come to an end. But that didn't happen. Instead, what happened is the eastward expansion of the NATO. It not only expanded into the 6 former Eastern Bloc countries, which once came under USSR influence zone, but it also extended its membership to the former Soviet republics themselves, namely Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania. And during all of that expansion, Russia couldn't do anything, but just watched in frustration. And then it became too much for Russia when the NATO members in 2008 NATO Bucharest summit at Romania decided to extend their membership to Ukraine and Georgia in the near future. But Russia didn't take that decision of NATO very lightly. Then Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said that Russia would do anything to prevent Ukraine and Georgia to become part of NATO because, according to him, it poses the expansion of NATO into the Ukraine poses a direct threat to Russia's security. Another Russian politician, then Russia's MP belonging to the same party as Putin, Sergei Markov, said that NATO membership of Ukraine would be seen as wanting conflict with Russia. During that NATO summit, then US President George W. Bush was furious to make Ukraine and Georgia member of the NATO. But on the other hand, France and Germany were cautious enough and forced the USA to postpone the proposal of extending NATO's membership to Ukraine and Georgia, because they very well knew such a move can completely destabilize Southern and Eastern Europe. Even the general public of Russia does not hold favorable views about NATO. According to a Pew survey of 2019, around 60% of the Russian public holds unfavorable views about NATO, and only 16% holds favorable views about NATO, which is the least in all the countries surveyed. And this trend of favorableness is decreasing from year to year. And to dismiss all of that by saying it's just a result of Putin's propaganda machine, which had indoctrinated common Russians in believing that NATO is a mortal threat to the Russia's security, would not do justice to the fact. Because one should not forget that the Russian establishment and even the normal Russian public perceive Russia's security interest in the same manner, in the same way as they had when they were still fighting the Cold War before 1989. Thus, out of old fears and anxieties, they perceive any eastward expansion of NATO as a threat to the existence of their country. And whether their fears are legit or not is a matter of different discussion. But the point is, West completely failed to understand and take into account these fears. But now let's continue. In the subsequent years, after 2008, USA and NATO did some more things to provoke Russia. The USA gradually increased its military personnel strength in Eastern Europe. Before the 2014 Ukrainian conflict, no US forces were deployed in the Baltic countries. But subsequently, more than 4,000 US troops get stationed in Poland, nearly 1,000 US troops were deployed in Romania, and some hundreds were deployed in the Baltic countries. But the most controversial action of the US military or NATO came in the form of the construction of anti-missile defense systems in the countries of Romania and Poland. Not surprisingly, this created a lot of controversy, as the US gave it excuses that the only reason why the anti-missile systems is being set up is to counter any missile threat coming from Iran. But Russia became suspicious. Russia's worry was the missile launchers, basically the Mk-41, installed in these facilities can very well be used for offensive purposes against Russia. In short, Russia's fear was the USA behind the facade of using these missile launchers for defense purposes against Iran can actually be used to launch offensive cruise missiles or ballistic missiles at Russia. And this will become a disadvantage for Russia if any war broke out in the future. So you are getting the idea of how this whole tension was building up. First, NATO expand itself into the east towards Russia. Then NATO summit of 2008 decided to make Ukraine its member in near future. Then the US began to deploy its troops in eastern Ukraine. US and NATO also organized large-scale military exercises, and at last they installed their anti-missile system in Poland, which they claim for defense purposes. So all these events culminated into something very intolerable for Russia. And at the beginning of this year, when Russian forces were building up at the Ukrainian border, it was not that Russia closed every channel of diplomacy to peacefully resolve the whole crisis. In reality, Russia early this year had put out its main demands before the USA to avoid any military conflict. So what were these main demands from Russia? First and foremost, NATO would ensure that it would not expand to any other Eastern European countries, which practically means stopping Ukraine from becoming a member of NATO. Second, a refusal to deploy any offensive weapon next to the Russian border. And third and the last main demand was NATO would withdraw its military presence and its military infrastructure from every Eastern European country. But in the written document submitted by the USA to Russians in response to these demands, all these three main demands, which were the major security concerns for Russia, were practically ignored. And instead, the USA completely ruled out Russia's request of barring Ukraine from becoming a NATO member. Not just that, after rejecting Russia's diplomatic efforts, you know what the US did next? They further increased their military presence in the Eastern Europe, sending additional 3,000 American troops to Poland, Germany and Romania respectively, and threatening Russians with deadly sanctions if they even think about invading Ukraine. And what happened next is all history, as we all know. Wait, you might be thinking why Russia is so insecure when it's come to NATO expansion, US military presence in Europe and the deployment of missile systems in Eastern Europe. And now what I will reveal to you will make you wonder whether Russia's security concerns were truly illegitimate, and also it will expose any hypocrisy on the part of the West. So let's continue. Have you ever read about Cuban Missile Crisis? Let me share with you some brief history. In 1989, a Cuban revolution took place. An American-friendly Cuban regime run by a brutal dictator by name Fulgencio Batista was overthrown, and in his place, revolutionary leader Fidel Castro became the head of the Cuba. Soon his policies were seen in much alignment with socialist model. He soon nationalized all the key Cuban industries, and that really hurts commercial interests of the United States. And then under his regime, Cuba became too close with Soviet Union. They both developed military ties. Soon USSR began to export arms to Cuba to strengthen its defense. And mind you, Cuba's geographic location makes it a point of contention for the US. The minimum distance between the Cuba and US is not even 90 miles. And if such a close neighbor country starts to get friendly with USA adversary, which was USSR in those times, then things would not go very well. Soon in 1962, USSR leader Nikita Khrushchev decided to deploy some nuclear capable ballistic missiles in the Cuban region. It was done as a response to the similar deployment of ballistic missiles by the US in Italy and Turkey, which were also very close to the borders of Soviet Union. You know how the USA reacted to the whole missile deployment in Cuba? They reacted as if it is the beginning of the end of the world, while forgetting that they were the first who deployed nuclear capable ballistic missiles in the Europe and Turkey, which were meant to target the Soviet Union. Nonetheless, the USA soon imposed a naval blockade all around Cuba, preventing any shipment from USSR which was carrying military equipments to reach Cuba. Soon the pressure became intense enough that the USSR has to withdraw all the ballistic missiles from Cuba in the favor of the security interests of USA. But this is not the only action that the USA took against Cuba. There also happened a full-blown military invasion of Cuba by the Cuban exiles, trained and militarily equipped by the CIA. Not just that, even multiple assassination attempts also took place against Fidel Castro. At least 8 such events or attempts are documented and accepted by the USA establishment itself. Even USA intelligence agencies and military also prepared a detailed plan to help pro-American anti-Castro Cubans activists within Cuba in order to make them overthrow the Castro regime. Also to carry out sabotage plots inside the Cuba targeting key industrial facilities in order to hurt Cuban economy. And even they suggested to plot fake terrorist attacks like hijackings and bombings that will be carried out against the American public, and by planting fake evidence to show that Cuba is responsible for these such attacks, and it will give American military sufficient justification to invade Cuba and overthrow Castro's regime. And I am really not making this up. You can yourself read the official documents on these operations, which were known as the Operation Northwood and Operation Mongoose. But fortunately enough, these plans were never executed. Then US President John F. Kennedy rejected the whole idea of plotting fake terrorist attacks and blame Cuba. So if you are still there with me till now, you might be wondering, did I really digress from the topic? No, I really did not. My point this whole time was to make you understand that USA's establishment did all these previously mentioned illegitimate things with only a single goal in its mind: to overthrow the current Cuban regime, which they believed to be hostile against Americans' security interests. Just because Cuba was an ally of Soviet Union, and given the fact of Cuba's geographical proximity to the USA, the USA's concern was that the Soviet Union can use Cuba, militarily speaking, which USSR indeed did during the Cuban Missile Crisis, to threaten America's vital security interests, which was planting nuclear capable missiles near to the American homeland. So my point of discussing history here is, why can't the USA understand that Russia can have similar concerns and fears, in the response of which it demands an end to NATO's expansion further eastwards, and also demand removal of so-called defensive missile systems from the location in the Eastern Europe, which Russians fear they can be used to target their own country. I am asking you viewers, giving the historical background of the Cold War, are Russia's security demands really illegitimate? This is not really a tough question to answer. Should the security concerns of a superpower be completely ignored and trampled by the very world superpower which always made sure that its security interests should always be looked after? Think about it. Now with this, we end our first video on Ukraine. In the next part of it, we will talk about some issues or factors internal to Ukraine that are needed to be addressed in order to put an end to separatism in eastern Ukraine. Because, mind you, pro-Russian separatism in eastern Ukraine is the primary reason behind the building up of all the circumstances which ultimately led to the situation as of now. Because if separatism wouldn't have been there in the first place in Ukraine, the Russian invasion of Ukraine might have not taken place. But all of that will be in the next video. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you enjoyed this video, you can like this video and share it with your friends. And if you like my content, please subscribe to my channel. We will soon meet again. Until then, please take care of yourself and your family. Dhanyavad, goodbye, thank you, and namaste.